so we are planning it today. So in this discussion, what we are going to do is we are going to talk about ECMAScript version number 5, version number 6, and certain basics of object-oriented programming. So we will talk about something like what exactly objects are, how do we define the objects, how do we define the constructor functions, and so on. And then somewhere we will also talk about like why the standards are required and how do we use the standards in the application. So it's going to be a small session today. So agenda that we have today as usual. So agenda is like we need to talk about something like how do we define objects, then understanding something called as prototyping in case of JavaScript. Then we talk about the odd ways of inheritance in case of JavaScript, and then obviously we will talk about ES5, ES6, why do we require, why do we have it here, so on. So let's continue. So in this discussion we are going to talk about something like everything is object. We'll understand the proto, and we will also talk about like creating objects in JavaScript. So just like last session, we will be we will have this session in a demo oriented way. So I'm going to switch to VS Code now. So I have opened Visual Studio Code now. And I'm going to create a new file here. We will try to save this file as demo1.html. And in this file, we will be creating a basic setup. I'll remove what is not required or what you already know. Now, and then we will start writing the script here. So now, in order to understand objects concept, so in JavaScript, by default, everything can be considered as an object, and in JavaScript, objects are ultimately going to have keys and value pairs. So everything will act as a key value in case of JavaScript here. So how do we define any object? So in here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with very basic example of creating a person object. So this is very routine example that I'm sure those who have learned OOP a bit, they must have seen similar kind of examples with respect to C++, with respect to Java, with respect to C#. So we will be adding one JavaScript object now. So let me define one variable here. Let's call it as person, but instead of calling it as a variable, I really want it to act as an object. And since object is going to act as a key value pair here, what we will do is a person can have, let's say, a number, let's say maybe 1 initial value. A person can have a name. So I'm going to go and define here. I'll put comma here. Name, let's put a default value like Mahesh. And instead of just having something called as number and name, maybe what I'll do is let's put only this much first. Now let's say a person has number and person has a name. Initial values are already defined. So in order to use this person, what I'll do is I'll always use person.number. I may use this value on the console. So console.log I'll say, and I will use person.number. I may go and print the name as well. So I'll put person.name as well. And then what I'll do is I'll try to run this project. So I'm going to go to desktop. I'm going to open browser, and just to understand the content, I'll be using F12 as in shortcut. So if I refresh, it prints 1 and Mahesh. So what has happened on line number 11 here, we printed person number and person name. Imagine a scene if this code that we have written was supposed to be a part of a function. Maybe let's say print. So this function is actually going to print all the data. So this function is acting on person's number and person's name. In that case, if this function is supposed to work with person, in that case, why can't it be part of the person itself? So just like in case of normal maybe OOP programming, what we can have is we can always have members, and the functions acting on those members will always be part of the same entity, of the same class itself. You will find out in JavaScript also, if at all you are looking for maybe something similar, you can have print as in key, and you will define this function content over here. So person is an object now in JavaScript, which has got number, which has got name, and which has got a print along with as a function acting on top of those members. So how do I start using it? In order to use this person, we can always go for person.number, or we can just start using person.print. Let's say we can call this function and we can just see it getting printed. So it prints 1 and Mahesh one more time. Can I change this member values? Why not? You can very well go for person.number equal to 199. You can put person.name, let's put it as ABC. And now you will notice it gives me 199 and ABC on the console. So things to understand, I can access the members. This is more like a public getter setter. And then I can access so-called, you can say, a print function which is acting on top of those members. So here person for me is an object, and then I just have used person in here. Okay, what will happen if I don't want to let's say use? I'm going to copy paste this code. Mostly I will prefer to have all the code written in this HTML itself. So I have copied the code. This maybe code that I've just commented, I'll put it as basic object creation. And I'll copy paste it again one more time. So I just use person object in this manner. So what if there are like more than one maybe person objects that we need to create? So if person is one object, what if I do something like this? I'll define var, let's say p1 equal to a person here. Keep it in mind, I'm not using new keyword. And I'll define var p2 equal to person one more time. And then what I'll do is I'll say p1 dot, let's say name, I'll put up here. Let's put it as ABC. And I will call p1 dot, let's say print, I'll call. Similar way, I'll define p2 dot name, and I will try to put here maybe xyz. Number value is 1 right now, and I'll put up here p1 dot number and p2 dot number as well. So I'll just change it. p1 dot number is equal to 100 here, and here I'll put p2 dot number equal to 200. So what I have right now is I have got both the values changed, and now I'll be calling p2 dot print. Now keep it in mind, what has happened is I have just defined, I called p1 print, then I called p2 print. Save it, let's try running it. You will find out p1 print has given me 100 ABC and p2 print has given me 200 XYZ. It seems it's working just like we expect it to work. Now let's take a bit change in here. After I print p2 dot print, after I print values for p2, let's say one more time I'll put p1 dot print. So this did print here this number and name. I'm going to put one more time p1 dot print. Let's see what we get. Now you will notice 200 XYZ and 200 XYZ, which means if I just remove this from here and if I run it, you will see p1 and p2, for both of them you will find out the values are these values. What does that mean? This means that actually p2 is not acting as another object. p2 is referring to the same object which is actually named as person in this case. So this doesn't create a new object, it's just a reference of person. p2 becomes reference of a person, and then no matter how many times you keep on using this reference, ultimately you will always have this single object, which means this particular way that we have seen just now, JavaScript has got two different ways of creating an object, or JavaScript lets you create objects in two different ways. One of the way available is this literal notation, we call it as. So when I say literal notation, this syntax is something which will let you create one object and let you use the same object every time, which means even if you want, you are not going to go and have a new object constructed now. So whenever you wish to use same object all over, or single object only to be constructed in your application, you will go for literal notation syntax. That is something we need to understand and we need to keep it in mind. What is the other way of maybe creating a object? So we'll come back to it. Before that, let us proceed with some other discussion now. So one more time, I already have a person here. Let's try commenting this piece of code. Again, we'll comment this piece of code. So we saw one way of creating objects. Again, I'll copy paste here. So a person has number, person has name, and person has a print function associated. So what will happen now is, if I define var, maybe let's say employee, and this employee is just going to be one empty object right now. So person has number, name, and print. Maybe employee has nothing right now. But then in general, I'm sure all of us have seen this behavior or similar kind of example. In case of Java or .NET or any OOP programming language, generally we can always see hierarchy like employee is a person, student is a person, employer is a person. And just like that, you will find out here, I would like to have employee .name, .number, and .print function to be available. But then we define objects, we define classes specifically for the purpose of reusability. So we have here, person is already having number and name and print kind of, we can say, definition already done. So why should employee define it one more time? Can I just go and define and call maybe employee.print over here? Obviously what will happen, if I run this code, we will end up in exception that employee print is not a function available. But I really want this employee print to have or act as a function, and it should always refer this print from here. How do I manage this? So to do that, I'm going to use one, this seems like a magic, this seems like a trick now. I'm going to use one routine line which is not supposed to be used every day, or which is not supposed to be used, because there is a better approach of doing it. So just to help you understand this concept, what I'll do is I'll put employee, I'll use a property called as proto. So underscore underscore proto and underscore underscore. Why the property name is like this? This property name with respect to employee, considering everything is object in JavaScript, this particular property you will see is written in this way, so that you should not, like, even by mistake you should not use it. But then as we need to understand this concept, I'm going to use it just to help you understand how exactly prototypal inheritance works in case of JavaScript. So I use employee dot underscore underscore proto and underscore underscore, and I will simply assign it to person. So now will it allow me call something called as print? Refresh it, and now you will see it prints 1 and Mahesh. How does this work? How does employee have a print function? What is it that this line does behind the scene? So to help you understand what happens behind the scene, I'm going to use Notepad now. So I'll start Notepad and help you understand this code. So what did I do in my code just now? I defined this person with these values. So let's say I define person, and that person has a key value pair. Everything is an object. Object is a key value pair. So in short, we have number 1, we have name as in Mahesh, and we have print as in function, some function here, some code here. This is how the key value pairs are defined with respect to person. Now what happens in JavaScript is, at any moment in here, at any moment when you define object like this, person object like this, you'll find out by default JavaScript also adds one more property, a special property you can call it as, which is actually there in your person object right now by the name underscore underscore proto and underscore underscore. Okay, what is it that this property is for? This property is typically a key value pair. So this is key and value pair. Right now in this key value pair, let's say there is nothing. Let's say it's empty. So by default, your person is going to have this proto property, which is ultimately collection of key value pairs, and it will have your own key value pairs as well. So now what is it that this line that you did? You defined emp. I believe I defined emp only, or employee. Okay, so I used employee. So when I define employee in my code, it was like maybe I should define it in this manner. So it is employee. When I define, what happens behind the scene? Employee has nothing, right? But then since employee is defined and it is empty with these contents, you will see since employee is an object, you will find out employee also has got this property available, which is called as proto, which means this also has a proto property, and this proto property is going to be something which is called as a key value pair. So we will have a key value pair here, key colon value. However, this key value pair is also empty. Let's say right now it doesn't have anything. So now initially when I called with respect to employee, when I called print function, what happens is JavaScript engine is going to go and look that is employee property collection is having print. It won't find print. Then what is it that JavaScript engine does is it tries to find print function into proto property. But then as I said, initially when we did not have this code, print is searched in employee here. And now if I run this code, you'll find out it shows me error. Employee print is not a function. So if it doesn't find it here, by default it looks for function inside a proto. And then if I just mention that this line employees proto is going to be person, which means base is going to be person, ultimately employee print function will be searched in person now. So employees print function, if I don't find it here, it will actually go to person now, and then in person's property collection it will find it. If it is not here, it will again search it here, and if it does not exist, then we will end up in exception. So if I just go back to code now, save it and refresh it here, check it prints 1 Mahesh. What will happen with respect to employee if I call print 1 2 3? This function does not exist. So if I refresh it, we will again end up in error that employee print 1 2 3 is not a function. So what has happened is this proto is always going to help you maybe define some sort of base in this case. Can I have maybe one more available? So suppose if I remove this and if I define person or another object, special emp, or special emp is equal to again blank. And what will happen if I define special emp dot underscore underscore proto is equal to emp or employee? So what will happen now in this case? You will see here, just like employee, we define now special employee, and the special employee also has got underscore underscore proto, and then we will have here emp defined, and special employee is empty in this case. So what happens now? Special employee, whenever we start using, I should save this as text1. So when special employee object is going to give a call here to print function, you will end up in error. One more time, same way. Sorry, something. Okay, if I don't define it in this way, then we will end up in error. It's not a function. But if I define special emp as an employee, as a proto, you'll find out what does that mean is special employee dot print. When you call, this function will be searched in special employees key value pair first. If not found, it will go to proto, that is emp. And if it is employee here, it will search in employees key value pair collection. If not found, it will go to person. In person, it will try to find it. It finds it and it gives a call to the person's print function. That's how this typical hierarchy works. Okay, how exactly this proto is defined? Who is base of who right now? Right now, special emp's base is going to be employee. Employee's base is going to be person in this case. Is there any base of a person? There is. Everything in case of JavaScript comes from a base type called as object in here. So again, a base object offers you certain number of keys and values which are always going to be there in case of proto. So what we need to understand now is what will happen if I put something like here or here. If I put the same function one more time, what will happen if I put in special employee this print function? Let's say, just to understand easily, let's say special employee is defined with the print function, and here I'll have something like special emp. And if I try to run, you will find out it prints special emp now. Why is that? Because when in this case now special emp has got this print function only. So when special emp print is called, first it is searched in the current object's implementation. If found, we will call it. If not found, we will go to the proto, that is base. If proto doesn't have it, we'll go to proto's proto, ultimately base, and so on. So you will have to understand this, that this proto property is going to help us a lot in terms of inheritance in this case, in case of JavaScript. So we don't actually go and give a call to proto like this. There is dot prototype, as in typically object dot prototype is something that we defined it as. We'll see that part in the next discussion, but as of now, I hope this is more and more clear. So now after all this, what I want to do is I would like to see another approach of creating the object. So just like we used literal notation of creating an object, and what we try to understand is literal notation concept we use as and when we want a single object of that kind to be available all the time. But what if I want multiple people to be defined? I want person 1, person 2, person 3. We observed here person 1, person 2 are ultimately, or P1 and P2 is referring to same object. I really want multiple number of objects to be created. Then here is what we do. This approach is actually called as constructor function approach. So I'll define constructor function approach. And what do we do with this approach is this. Normally we can define a function, let's call it as employee. And this way we can just have some parameter picked up, let's say number and name. We can always define here something like this dot number equal to whatever you have received, this dot name equal to what you have received, and then I want this dot print to be available as a function which is going to go and print on the console certain values. So I'll put up this dot number and plus this dot name. Okay, how do I use it now? So this function employee that we have created, I need to use it. So how do I use it? This way. I always define var, let's say p1 or e1 equal to new employee. I'll pass on a couple of parameters, 1 and abc. I'll call e2. I'll pass on here 2 and I'll pass on here xyz. And now I will call e1 dot print and e2 dot print. I'll also call e1 dot print just to help you understand it's not actually going to change anything. So refresh it. It's 1 abc, 2 xyz and again 1 abc. Reason behind that, so I was able to create here, or I'm able to create here, two objects of employee. So in case of constructor function, you will be able to create multiple objects of the same class. Since we are writing the code with respect to ES5 standard right now, ES5 standard, you will find out to define a class in case of JavaScript, we actually use a function word only. But in case of ES6, you will find out there is a change. We have something called as class keyword available. And then instead of using typical prototypal inheritance, you will find out one can very well use extends kind of a word to do the inheritance, which means there are some thin changes that you will find out ES5, ES6 has. So whenever you need to, when some object to define and you really want multiple instances of that so-called, you can say, object to be created, you will start using constructor function kind of approach of object creation. And then if you really want a single object to be created only for particular entity, you can always use literal notation kind of a syntax. So you have to understand this content. So what exactly, like when I said everything is object in case of JavaScript, what does that mean? So what I'm going to do is, to understand this concept, I'm going to pick up one more demonstration. So I'll create a new file now. I'll save this file as demo2.html. And then one more time we will use a shortcut to generate the base code. So I'll have this HTML created. I'll remove the meta and we will go for writing some basic code again. So I'll use script here. Now to understand everything is object in case of JavaScript, what we'll do is we will put here var, let's say data equal to something. So or var emp, empty. Then I will also be using var maybe let's say function, let's say f1 equal to a function. Rather, why should I use it like this? Maybe I should use function directly, function f1 with no code into it. And then I will define var array equal to some blank array. Okay, three different types is what I've used. One I function used, I used array, and then before that I used some object. And then I'm going to use debugger here. Okay, now what does it mean by like everything is object in case of JavaScript? To help you understand this concept, what I'll do is I have put a debugger here. So let me go back to code and call demo2 now in here. So I'll be calling demo2. Okay, we are here now. These are all are initialized. I'll go back to console. Now let's see. So what we have here is I used a emp just now. So emp is one object which is defined. Now emp, as I said, can have getter setters, can have members and functions. I haven't defined any function into it. So still I'm going to check here emp dot underscore underscore proto. What is it that emp is proto we have? You will find out sometime back in this discussion I said there is a person details like these available here, or this is available, employees details like empty are available here, or person's detail from here are made available here. Just like that, you will find out along with these that I have added as a proto, you will find out certain extra things are also available. So I did not say anything in employee, but employee already has a proto which has got several key value pairs. And you will find out exactly from where these objects or these functions or key value pairs are coming. These key value pairs are coming from a type called as object. Okay, let's see. Something like emp dot. Now emp dot, there was a print function back. I haven't defined anything, but with respect to emp, you will be free to call certain functions now. Has own property, property is enumerable, to local string, to string, and so on. These are kind of typical getter setters, and these are so-called functions that you will find out above. So emp has a base which is called as object. Okay, what will happen if I put up here something called as there was emp and there was f1. If f1 is a function, this is also object only, which means even function is object. So f1, if I say has proto, f1's proto will be some sort of object, and then that proto's proto is going to be object again, which means it's a third level inheritance. It's like C inherits from B and B inherits from A. In sequence, it will be A, B, and C. So it's like f1 is one object, f1 inherits from some base object, and some base object inherits from actual object. So similar way, there is another thing that I have created which is called as array. So there was array dot underscore underscore proto. It has got again concat method, copy within method, fill method, find method. But then from the base, if I get these methods, then what is base's base in this case? This is one more time going to be object. So you will find out, if I just clean this up, there's an inbuilt function in case of JavaScript called as typeof. If I put up typeof emp is object. If I put up typeof maybe f1, it says function. But if I say f1 dot underscore underscore proto, it's going to go and give me function. If I say underscore underscore proto, it's going to go and give me object. So if I just go for just like f1, if I just put up arr, object. So if I just clean this again, emp inherits from object, so emp is object. So I may say emp dot underscore underscore proto, it's object. f1 proto is object, and arr's proto and proto is going to be object. Ultimately all of them are coming from a same base called as object in case of JavaScript. Okay, fair enough. Now what will happen if at all I try something like this? In emp, if I define a property like number and name, let's say Mahesh here. So what will happen in here itself, if I go back to code, if I refresh here, I'm already in debugger now. So emp object is declared. So at any moment, if you're looking for emp.name, it can print obviously. But programmatically, if at all you really want to know if the name property exists here, so you will find out we have a very nice method available with object directly. So object dot has own property. Which object has own property? I need to say emp has a property which is named as something which is called as, let's say, name. Okay, was it name? Okay, I made a mistake here. I should have directly called it emp dot has own property which is called as name, and this gives me true. And then if I just say has a own property which is called as maybe number, it says true. If I say does it have a property which is called as address, it says false, which means does the emp itself has a name property defined, number property defined, and so on. So if I just go and define a proto quickly, where let's say special employee is equal to empty, I'll have here address. Let's put it as Pune. And if I just define special employee dot underscore underscore proto is going to be emp. Check now. If I refresh here, now we are in this code. If I say special emp dot has own property which is called as name, you will get false. But the same way, if you say something called as emp has own property called as name, you will get true. So employee has a property called as name, but special employee doesn't have a property called as name. But yes, special emp has a property which is called as address. So you will find out how this code is working. Behind the scene, you will find out JavaScript engine is using reflection to find out which particular object has what sort of properties in this case. So it's one of the very nice API that we have, that is called Reflection API with ES6, which is going to go and help you get these details. So anyway, Reflection API is made simple in ES6. It was anyway there before as well. So has own property is going to go and help you understand whether some object is holding particular property or not. So what we have seen just now is we have talked about everything is object in JavaScript. We tried to understand maybe what underscore underscore proto and underscore underscore property means, and then prototypal inheritance. We saw two different ways of creating object in JavaScript. One way was using literal syntax, and other way was constructor function. So now what we'll do is we will move to the next discussion. We will talk about like typical extends keyword. We will talk about class keyword as and when we start with the next series. So next series planned sometime next week will be something like mean series. So we will be talking about something like Angular. We will be talking about Node.js. We will also be talking about something like TypeScript, and there we will have to discuss about this ES6 more compared to ES5. So certain things are planned in next series as well. So moving to the next discussion now, what we have is we need to understand ES5, ES6, like what exactly this ECMAScript standard is and the history about it. So I know you can read this entire story in front of you, but then before like let me put in some points and let me drive the discussion. So I really want you to pay attention here, and specifically on the second slide, you will see interest or interesting facts put up. So here's how it goes, the discussion. It's like this. If we go back to the history, like we need to understand why standard is required. So standard is required for some X reason. Then what was the need in back in history, like the standardization was required. Who provided the standard? What was the problem that the standard was supposed to be offered to JavaScript? So we have to go back to a root to understand this concept. So you will find out way back, like when first browser was created, or even before when the first browser was created by Tim Berners-Lee. Tim Berners-Lee is well known as the father of World Wide Web. Tim Berners-Lee has a basic qualification of, you can say, being from background of physics. So Tim Berners-Lee joined CERN, which is a European center specifically for nuclear research. So and then like for a collaboration of some project. Now like the problem that he observed was something like many people keep on coming to CERN, and then everybody has some or other thing to contribute, but then there is no central repository or a way of accessing everybody's information was not available then. So what this guy did is created a project which is called as Inquirer Project. So using Pascal program back then, Tim Berners-Lee defined an Inquirer Project, but that Inquirer Project was running, which was like all good, but then everybody had to feed in their knowledge, feed in their content to this Pascal program using on top of CERN's proprietary operating system. So since everybody was supposed to go and visit this program and offer the knowledge or put up the knowledge, this program did not pick up and people did not show willingness to basically offer the content. So this project did not work well. And later on, when Tim Berners-Lee again joined in 91 CERN, so he created one of the first browser, which is called as World Wide Web. WWW was a browser name, and this particular browser was made in few days of time, in spare time, keeping libwww library as at a base. If you recall, in the first session we already have discussed about this library. So this library was made open, and there was a kind of session delivered by Tim Berners-Lee on top of this www project and on top of this library. So inspired from that lecture, you will find out 6 different browser development happened within 6 months of time. So in like half dozen browsers were announced in or launched in 6 months of time. So one of the very important browsers we are going to go and discuss only. So there was a browser which was made available by a person from Taiwan, which is well known as Viola www. This browser had a feature which it had a great UI, great user interface. So somewhere in 92 this browser came in market, and then our discussion is all based on top of Mosaic. So this Mosaic browser, as I said earlier, www browser was actually working only on something called as CERN's operating system. Later on it was made to work on multiple number of platforms by Tim Berners-Lee and associate. But then Mosaic was one of the first cross-browser, rather cross-platform browser. It used to work on Unix and other operating systems as well. So, and with great UI. It was announced by NCSA somewhere in 93. This browser, which is well known as Mosaic browser, basically made the World Wide Web popular. So now this particular browser, since made the web popular, some leads, some developers from this Mosaic browser team basically started something called as Netscape as in company. And then these people announced, based on top of Mosaic, these people announced something called as Netscape Navigator. Now what happens is, this Netscape Navigator obviously had a great rendering engine, supported some sort of extra tags like videos and icon like tags. Along with Netscape Navigator, along with this, one of the common thing that we had was, it was like only static pages is what Netscape used to show, or almost every browser back then used to show. So like what you see is what you get. But then there was a dynamic, maybe kind of you can say users intervention or users interactive with respect to user was really required. So in such cases, dynamic pages is what was required. And for building dynamic pages, there was a language required with some condition set, with some sort of, we can say, predefined statements or predefined constructs. And then it was decided by Netscape then, that is, we will have dynamic pages constructed, so we will have a scripting language developed. So initially, what the so-called Netscape Navigator team did was, they hired a person called Brendan Each specifically to prepare a language or create a language. And what was suggested was, we will have, there were two different approaches available back then. Two different languages were very popular back then. One was Java from Sun Microsystems and one was Scheme as in language. So Brendan Each was assigned with the work, that is either work with a collaboration with Sun Microsystem and then develop something which is similar to Java but working inside a browser, and then or maybe define something like Scheme and then ultimately create a language or define something which is similar to Scheme. So later on, what Brendan Each did was, it's like within 10 days of time, Brendan Each developed JavaScript. Initially it was called as LiveScript, and later on within 3 months of time it was renamed as JavaScript. So JavaScript first version was given in 95. Now the word Java actually has got nothing to do with the JavaScript, because it's not something like it was just a marketing thing. So Java was popular then, and then kind of the syntax which is taken mostly is from Scheme scripting language. So you'll find out it was a marketing strategy, kind of a just to make JavaScript popular, they use the same word as that of Java. So we have something like JavaScript was available, people liked it, people started using it with respect to Netscape Navigator. Now obviously there is a parallel you can say competitor that we have, and there was Internet Explorer by Microsoft somewhere in 95 itself. So Microsoft Internet Explorer also needed some sort of you can say language for interactivity. So what Microsoft did is, they reverse engineered this what we called as LiveScript, and they tried to construct something which is called as JScript in case of 1996. So now we had two kind of you can say market movers. One was Netscape Navigator using JavaScript and one was Internet Explorer using JScript. Internet Explorer actually picked up very well. in market. And then you will find out when we only focus on JavaScript as of now. So there was a war which was like browser war going on between Netscape and Internet Explorer, and JavaScript, just to make it more popular, Netscape wanted JavaScript to run on other browsers as well. So JavaScript needed a standardization. Why exactly standardization is really required? So to understand this concept, one of the very interesting example we can have here is something like, let's say all of us use keyboard, but then I'm sure most of us must have faced issues while using some sort of function keys. Something like the keyboard structure with respect to up arrow key, down arrow key, alt control, maybe enter key, or using a mouse pad, you'll always find out there's always a concern that developers or people have when they use somebody else's machine or somebody else's keyboard. However, you will find out, barring these other keys, if you focus on only the character keys that we have, you'll always find out there is the same common standard that we have. So if you notice it well, maybe typing on maybe every keyboard will be easy, but then when it comes to operating other keys, it may be difficult on, while referring different brands and different companies' keyboards. So you'll find out, why can't we just have a standard specifically for keyboard building? Like we will have once the standard is given, and once A company or B company or C company starts building the keyboards, they can follow the same standard and they can sell it at some X price or Y price or Z price. Ultimately, the buyer will not have to worry about it. So buyer will use A laptop or B laptop or C laptop, keyboard. Ultimately, you will find out he just has to learn using one keyboard only. You'll find out, and person can use any company's keyboard. So standardization helps the market itself, the companies which are like vendors itself. So JavaScript, which was given somewhere in so-called, you can say 95 or so, you will find out JavaScript actually needed a standard. Why was that? Because JavaScript actually announced some certain features, and back then in parallel there were some other languages also were there in market. As I said, Scheme was there in market, Lisp was there in market, and these kind of, you can say, languages which were popular back then, even C++. So these popular languages including C++, they always followed some standard which is called as ECMA standard. ECMA is ultimately European Computer Manufacturers Association. So this particular organization always managed to basically give some guidelines and give some standards to computer manufacturers. Like computers has to be manufactured, or computer has to be computer sets has to be as per some standard or as per some guidelines, so that it can be like common for usage all over, whether A company builds it or B company builds it. So ECMA was also into standard for coding languages or programming languages back then. So ECMA already had some standard for scripting languages, but not for browser or client-side scripting languages. So what ECMA had was already standard for scripting, and what Netscape had was a language, with them. So Netscape ultimately, in collaboration with ECMA, announced that we will have first standard with respect to the client-side scripting language. So ECMA was approached in 96, and ECMA released the first standard in 1997. And then when I say standard was announced, it means how do you define a function, what features are needed actually for a particular scripting language, how one should define a function, what sort of loops or programming primary types one should offer, what sort of loops or constructs are really required, how can somebody define a function, how can somebody return from a function. These things is something that was there in standard. So JavaScript adopted that standard, and then JavaScript always kept in touch with the standard, or kept itself, kind of, you can say, as per the standard. So we had ECMAScript 2, ECMAScript 2, ECMAScript 3 as a standard. Later on, we started calling it as ECMAScript instead of calling it as JavaScript. So ECMAScript 2 and ECMAScript 3 in 99. Then JavaScript started following standard, but JScript did not follow it. So later on, you will find out Internet Explorer did go popular. It was very well. It was #1 browser. But then later on, as and when Firefox, later on Chrome, came in market, specifically Google Chrome actually overhauled the excellence, in the sense to compete with Chrome, everybody had to accelerate. Everybody had to, keep their standards high. So you will find out when Chrome overhauled the experience, you will find out somewhere, just to keep themselves in a market, every leading parties, whether it is whether it is Firefox supporting JavaScript engine, or Chrome supporting JavaScript engine, or IE supporting JavaScript engine. Ultimately, JavaScript engine is a program which just has to understand the JavaScript based on some standard, needs to convert that JavaScript code into something like machine code, and then just needs to feed it to the CPU. So every browser vendor mostly follows a different JavaScript engines. For example, current version of Internet Explorer, that is Edge, follows Chakra as in JavaScript engine. Then there is something called as Firefox follows typically what we called as I believe it is Thunderbird, but we need to check. And then there is something called as Chrome, which currently follows V8 as an engine. So this is also used by Angular. So Chrome follows V8. Recent IE version follows something called as Chakra as an engine. And these engines needs to understand against which standard JavaScript is written, and whether they can actually compile it into something called as machine code, and can they understand it and hand it over to the CPU. So instead of having some sort of disagreements all the time, so in that case, what every vendor decided is, every vendor basically had a meet somewhere in 2008, and then they decided to basically follow something called as ECMA standard. So everybody agreed to follow ECMA standard 5 specifically for their client-side scripting languages. That's exactly where everybody agreed to support JavaScript. Everybody agreed to support features from ES5. So almost like after 99, 2008 was a year when ES5 was announced, and then we still continue using ES5. In recent 2015, there was ES6 standard which was announced. Some browsers are yet to support ES6 as in standard. So people still continue to use or continue to do development in ES5. But then if you know your clients are going to use browser which is supporting ECMAScript standard 6, supporting JavaScript engine, you are very free to use ES6 standard as well. And then now JavaScript is such a settled language that is almost in programming languages category, you will find out that's the #1 language that people use today. So now that we know that the standards were required, so that we can anybody who is building a browser, anybody who is building and using a JavaScript engine has to understand what sort of code snippet and what sort of vocabulary we have in case of JavaScript, what features we need to understand from JavaScript. So all that was made available in terms of standard. So whatever code that we have authored so far in this discussion, or even in the last session's discussion, you will find out all the code that we have written, it is actually based on top of ES5 standard. So some basic things exist here, like ES5 standard had string, number, boolean, null and undefined as in types available. When it comes to ES6, there is a new type available called as symbol. Symbol is typically we use it for typically private properties construction. So we'll see that part somewhere in maybe when we jump to TypeScript and maybe ECMAScript 6. Not in this session. Now before we understand var and let const, let me go back to code here. Let me define a new project now, a new file here. Okay. So as we discussed, let me go back to VS Code. Let me take a new page. Let me save this and let me save it as demo3.html. Okay. Now in this file that we have, one more time I'll have some basics added. Now we'll again add a script here. Now in this example, what I'm going to do is just to understand some concept, I'll use here something like var, let's say counter, equal to, let's say 100. I'll define one function, let's call it as increase. And then I'll define counter equal to counter plus 1. I'm going to use console.log. I'll put here something like in function counter value is equal to, I'll put counter, and then I'll call increase function here, and then I print on the console.log outside function counter value, and I'll use counter one more time here. Let's save it and let's try to run this code. This is demo 3, so I'll pick up demo 3. Now we are here. Somewhere there's a problem. Okay, extra space or extra semicolon. Let's refresh it. See to it, in function counter value is 101 and outside counter value is also 101. So what has happened is I declared this global counter, and then here I also wanted to use counter. So normally what happens is, if this counter, I really wanted it to be local to this increase, which means I want this counter to be defined again specifically for, so called, you can see this function itself. Normally what people do is, if they really want to have maybe same variable name as that of the global variable that we have here, this global can be used by anybody, any function in here. So when people really want to have something same variable name, so it can be either by mistake they have this, or people may change the variable name to counter 1, counter 2, like that. So instead of having confusions here, that is, you just made a change to global variable, wherein the interest was, I really wanted to have here something like counter equal to 0, maybe var counter equal to 0. So ultimately what we are looking for is this counter to be different counter with the same name, but for a function, local scope, and this is to be global counter in this case. So in such cases, instead of we having a clash all over, now what you will see is we use a keyword called as let. So let will have that variable used only within the scope of these curly brackets. So whether these curly brackets belong to function, whether these curly brackets belong to if loop or try, you'll find out we can always define a scope of this variable now. So if I run this now, this counter value is 0 right now. Refresh it, you will see within the function counter value is 1 and outside the function the counter value is 100. So this value 100, after calling increase, only this value increased, and this value did not, increase did not touch this value, and this value is available as it is 100. So you will find out whenever global variable names and local variable names, whenever you see a clash and you really want to define a scope for a particular variable, you can always use let. This is something we use a lot in ECMAScript 6. This is also something that we use a lot after maybe converting TypeScript into JavaScript. So we will see that part in main session anyway. So this is something which is new in case of ECMAScript 6. Now let us say, suppose if I go and maybe try to define it like this, counter equal to 99, or even here if I say counter equal to 99. So what has happened is I already have initialized variable to 100, and suppose somewhere maybe at the 100th line, let's say by mistake, assign it to 99. Do I really wish to change this value? No. But then if I going to be change this by mistake, maybe if the logic is going to go wrong, ultimately instead of declaring this as var, it is better you define this as constant. When you define this as constant, ultimately the value change is not allowed. So what you can do is, if I refresh now, save it first and refresh it, you will find out assignment to a constant variable is not allowed. So at line number 7 we will end up in error. So you will find out constant, once assigned a value you won't be able to change, and let define a local scope variable. You'll find out such things is something that ECMAScript 6 is what was announced. Now next, like after these basic things, you will also find out ECMAScript also added some more features. So if I just close this after const and let, Suppose if I define a function, maybe I wish to use here something like some function I define, let's say function f1, if I call, and function 1, let's say take a parameter, maybe message or name or say hi. And if I just put on a console something like hello or hi and person's name, how do I call this function? I can call this function like this. I can pass on my name and you will find out it just says hi Mahesh, and I can keep on calling this function number of times like this. So what is expected now is, instead of like we have this function and all, ECMAScript 6 offers you one feature which is actually well known as function without a name, and that is using arrow operator, which means instead of we having this function defined in this manner, let's say it's a say hi, we can pass on name, or for that matter any parameter, name is okay, and this goes to this particular function. If there are multiple lines, this curly brackets will help you to define multiple lines. So it is like a shorthand syntax for writing the functions now. So if I save this, if I refresh, it's going to work exactly in the same manner as it was working before. So a function which is having a parameter, and that parameter goes to this particular content, and then while you call it, you can very well call it in this manner. If this is going to help you a lot whenever there is a callback mechanism, which is in tomorrow's discussion or tomorrow's session we are going to discuss. So this is shorthand syntax, which is like those who are from C# background, you may see this syntax is similar to lambda expression syntax. So this is arrow operator syntax or arrow function syntax that we have. So this is again something new, which is execution wise it's a short code and a bit faster. Now when it comes to another feature, I have, let's say similar way, I'll have a function written, let's say maybe print, and this print is going to have two parameters, let's say number and name. And what I'm going to do is, on a console I'll print something like number plus name. So while I call this print function, I'll have to compulsorily pass on 1 and some value, let's say Mahesh. And if I call it, I'll get 1 and Mahesh printed over here. So what happens now? Print function gets called. What if I'm looking for same print function with number as default value and name as parameter? I'm looking for overload of print. Sometimes it should accept number and name. Sometimes it should accept only number but not name, and name should be some sort of default value. In such cases, instead of you defining multiple overloads for print function, what is expected is you can very well have parameters passed like this. Can a name have default parameter value? So I'll say name equal to, suppose maybe ABC. So that way, if I pass on 1 and Mahesh here, it will print 1 Mahesh anyway. But if I don't pass on Mahesh here, you will find out it's going to use 1 ABC. So if I pass, it will take my value. If I don't pass, it will take ABC as a value. So that way you can define all parameters as maybe default parameters, and then or optional parameters, and then you can have default value specified. This is similar to the default parameter concept, like what we call it as CPP. So we have default value specified. Keep it in mind, all default parameters should be like after what we call it as compulsory parameters that we have. So you can define multiple number of maybe default values to multiple number of parameters, and that way you can just avoid writing multiple number of overloads in case the default values will do the job, or default values are sufficient to complete the code. So going back to slideshow now, in case of ES5 the performance is low because the internal storage implementation is on a higher side. However, it is high in case of ES6. We already have discussed about defining functions and arrow functions. So these are not the only features that we have in case of ES6. We also have something called as default, we saw default parameter. Normally there is something called as export import, like you can export the code from A file to B file, you can import the modules. However, these things will be more and more clear as and when we continue with mean sessions in the next next week. Just like we defined a class and I said class keyword does not exist, we have function as in keyword. So using function or using literal syntax, we defined a class in case of JavaScript today. So similar way, you will find out you can define a class in case of JavaScript using class keyword in case of ECMAScript 6. And then you can also use extends in order to have the inheritance. It can be typically prototypal inheritance only, but then extends keyword can be used. So it can be something called as class employee extends p or extends person. Then there is another thing which we have called as promises. That promises will let you use some sort of you can say variables wherein the values can be assigned later on, which means it can be simple lazy assignment of a variables and you can start using it. So this is a bit risky, but then in a way good as well. Maybe you can just compare it with respect to observables. Anyway, we will discuss about I can say mean discuss about promises in detail in case of mean sessions. So collections, like there are some new methods available with respect to arrays now. There is something called as map and set. With respect to string, generally a boolean returning function, something called as get me some string starting with something, ending with something, and if it includes so and so thing. Array has got again find index of kind of you can say methods. Then object, like just like there was type of, and then object is, and you can always pass on some sort of what we call it as for comparison of two different objects, you can very well use object.is function. Then you have reflection API in case of ECMAScript 6, which is something that we it's kind of you can say maybe new way of writing reflection code. We already have seen that in object type we have something which is called as is property of or has a property. Kind of you can say function is internally going to use reflection only to observe the you can say availability of property inside the underscore proto as in collection. So this discussion takes us to the next slide, which is just a quick revision. So in this discussion we talked about something like what objects are, what prototype is, a couple of ways of you can say putting the objects. One way was typical literal notation, and second was constructor function. Then we talked about why exactly standards are really required. So that took us to history, and we discussed from like how JavaScript was added, why JavaScript was added, and why do we really need a standard in here. So in case you are looking for more detailed description about like what happened and why happened, so I will be adding those URLs. I believe I have already added those URLs in the comment box. So and then with respect to ES6 major OOP level changes, we are going to go and discuss in next planned session, which is going to be next week. So after this, if you like, this is typical slide, like you ask questions and I answer in comment box. So I'll skip this slide and move on to the next part, because anyway we will have question answers through comments. So feel free to put your questions in the comment box. I'll be answering all of your questions in the comment box. So in case you have questions later on after series or after the session is over, feel free to send me the questions on mahesh@bonaventuresystems.com, and I'll be happy to assist you or help you. So I'm going to close this live session. So ultimately streaming is what I'm going to go and close, but I'll keep on answering your questions in the comment box. So this is the schedule that we talked about. We are done with session 1, 2, third session we are done. Fourth was planned like yesterday, but today we are having it. And a fifth session, that is threading and callbacks. This session is something that we will plan tomorrow, that is 2nd of May. So be there for that session. So those who have questions, be here. Those who want to understand somebody the other people's question and answers as well, stay in the session. And those who have are like they have some work or they want to just move on with some other things, and they are free to close the session. So thank you specifically attending the session, and see you tomorrow. So I'll be answering questions now, and I'll be giving out some URLs which are going to go and help you understand some JavaScript documentation with respect to ECMAScript standard. So there are some URLs which I'm going to put up in comments. Thank you.